The prairie was dead quiet, the kind of quiet that gets in your bones, under a sky the color of a worn-out work shirt. Nathaniel Cross knew that silence. He lived in it, breathed it. It was the only thing that hadn't left him. His whole life was mending wire, splitting wood, and waiting for the sun to go down on another day he'd managed to get through alone. His cabin was a smudge on the horizon, a place where a man could disappear. The wind was his only neighbor, and it never asked any questions. Silence was his armor, his punishment, and his peace. He would have finished the day just like any other. But then he heard the cry. At first, he figured it was a coyote or a hawk caught in a trap. Something wild and dying, but the sound was wrong. It was thin, high, and it cut through the air with a human desperation that made the hairs on his arm stand up. He pulled his horse to a stop, listening. There it was again, faint but sharp as a needle. Trouble. Men like him didn't go looking for trouble, because trouble had a way of moving in and never leaving. Still, he nudged his horse forward, down a dusty draw he knew like the back of his own calloused hand. And that's when he saw them. A little girl, maybe 5 years old, was on her knees in the dirt. She was clutching the dress of a woman sprawled on the ground. The woman's dark hair was a mess across her face, her breathing was shallow, and in the crook of her arm was a bundle of cloth. A bundle that was whimpering. Nathaniel froze. He'd seen plenty of death in his time, but never this close to something so new. The little girl looked up. Her face was a mess of tears and dust, her eyes huge and old. "Mister," she whispered, her voice cracking, "it's Mama's last day alive. The wounds are fatal. Please, take my baby sister." He swung down from the saddle, his boots crunching loud in the stillness. He knelt, his big, rough hands hovering over the scene. He looked at the woman first. Her breath was a dry rattle. Her skin was ghost pale under the dirt. Dark stains bloomed on her skirt, sticky and wrong. She hadn't just collapsed. She'd been hurt. Badly. The little girl pushed the bundled infant toward him. "I'm too little," she sobbed. "I can't keep her warm. Please." Nathaniel's throat felt like it was full of sand. Years ago, he'd sworn off burdens. He'd promised himself he'd never carry another person's heart in his hands. But this wasn't a choice. This was a plea from a world he'd tried to lock out. The baby fussed, its tiny fists beating the air. And without thinking, he reached out and took the bundle. It was so light, but it felt heavier than anything he'd ever held. The infant's cries softened against his chest. The little girl let out a breath, like she'd been holding it her whole life. "Thank you, mister." He looked from the baby to the mother. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Her hand twitched in the dirt, a final tiny movement, and then it was still. She was gone. He wanted to put the baby down, get back on his horse, and ride until he forgot this ever happened. But the weight in his arms was real. It wasn't just a baby. It was a promise. The little girl tugged on his sleeve. "Is she gone?" He swallowed, the dust thick in his throat. He had no soft words left in him. "She's near enough to heaven, child." The girl buried her face in her mother's dress, her shoulders shaking. Nathaniel stood there, a newborn in his arms, the endless prairie all around him. His cabin was just 100 yards away, its door shut tight against the world. He could leave it that way, or he could open it and let the silence be broken for good. The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with a trust that cut him to the core. "You'll take us in, won't you?" He met her gaze. He didn't say a word, but the answer was in the way his boots turned toward home, carrying all three of them into a future he never asked for. The cabin had never been so loud. For years it was a tomb. The scrape of his boots, the crackle of the fire, the moan of the wind. That was it. Now it was filled with the thin cries of a newborn and the soft footsteps of a little girl who watched his every move. His armor of silence was cracking. He made a crib from an old crate, lining it with his softest shirts. The baby settled in, her tiny face scrunched up. The little girl sat on the floor watching him. Her name was May, she'd whispered. He didn't ask for more. He could see her history in the haunted look in her eyes. He warmed some milk, dipping a corner of a clean rag in it for the baby to suckle. It was clumsy work, but the infant drank. May's tense face relaxed. "She likes you," she said. "She likes the milk. he grunted, but the words felt good anyway. As the sun went down, he buried their mother in a shallow grave on the ridge. May stood beside him, clutching his sleeve, silent. He said a few rough words he couldn't call a prayer, and they went back inside. May's stomach growled. He gave her a bowl of beans and a piece of bread. She hesitated. Mama used to pray before we ate. The thought of praying made his throat burn. He hadn't spoken to God in years. Not since his wife. He pushed the thought away, but May was watching him, waiting. He bowed his head. Lord, he mumbled, his voice like gravel, thanks for the food, and for keeping these little ones alive. He pushed the bowl toward her. Eat. That night was the longest of his life. May slept on a pallet by the fire, her hand resting on the baby's crate. Nathaniel sat in his rocker, watching the flames, feeling like a stranger in his own home. When the baby cried, he picked her up, surprised by the warmth that seeped through his shirt, melting something frozen inside him. He'd carried rifles, axes, even dying men. Nothing felt as necessary as this. May started talking in her sleep. Fragments of memory, her mother's songs, the color of a shawl. A lullaby hummed in the dark. Every word was a tiny crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. At dawn, he stepped outside. The fresh dirt of the grave was a dark scar on the land. He took off his hat. I gave you my word, he whispered to the wind. I'll see to them. The cabin door creaked open. May stood there, wrapped in a blanket. She just looked at him, her eyes ancient. And in that look, he knew the promise was a chain, and it was wrapped around him for good. The quiet was over, but as he went to split the day's firewood, he noticed something else. Tucked inside the mother's dress, the one he'd folded neatly before the burial, was a small silver locket. He opened it. On one side was a faded portrait of the mother, looking younger, happier. On the other side wasn't a man. It was a strange symbol, like a coiled snake with a single black star for an eye. He'd never seen anything like it, and a cold feeling washed over him, a feeling that this wasn't just a tragedy. It was a secret, and it had just walked through his door. The locket felt cold in his palm. He tucked it deep into his pocket, a secret he now shared with the dead woman on the hill. He tried to put it out of his mind, focusing on the new rhythm of his life. Chores weren't just chores anymore. They were lessons. He showed May how to draw water, his big hands covering hers on the rough rope. When she finally pulled the bucket up, sloshing water all over her worn dress, she beamed. I did it. Almost, he said, the corner of his mouth twitching into something that might have been a smile. She followed him everywhere, a tiny shadow determined to earn her keep. She stacked kindling while he split logs. She carried nails in her fist when he mended the fence line. He found himself talking to her, explaining things without meaning to. The silence was being filled, not just with cries, but with questions and laughter. Her laugh was a shock, a quick, bright sound, like a bird taking flight. He hadn't heard laughter in this cabin in years. Not since. He shut that door, firmly. At night he rocked the baby, whose name they still didn't know. May would hum a soft, sad tune her mother used to sing. The cabin started to look different. May swept the floor every day. She put a wildflower in a jar on the table. The place was slowly turning from a shelter into a home. But the outside world was closing in. When he rode into town for flour and lamp oil, the whispers started. The store fell quiet when he walked in. Men stopped talking. Women pulled their children closer. He felt their eyes on his back, sharp and judging. That's him, he heard someone mutter, the one who took in those strays. He ignored them, his jaw tight, but as he was tying the supply sacks to his saddle, the storekeeper, a man named Silas, came out. Nathaniel, he said, his voice low, folks are talking, saying it ain't right. A man like you alone, with two little girls. They had nowhere to go, Nathaniel said, not looking at him. That ain't the point. There's a proper way. The church or the law. Silas trailed off, then his eyes got shifty. Where'd they come from anyway? What was their name? Nathaniel thought of the locket, the secret. He just shook his head. Doesn't matter. He rode home with the town's judgment heavy on his shoulders. He didn't want to bring their poison back to the cabin, but it clung to him like dust. 2 days later, the preacher showed up. Reverend Harron was a man built of sharp angles and scripture. He stepped into the cabin without an invitation, his eyes sweeping over the room, landing on May and the baby. "The Lord's work is a heavy burden, Nathaniel," the preacher said, his voice booming in the small space. "It's just taking care of 2 kids," Nathaniel grumbled. "The town is concerned. They say you should turn them over to the church. We have families who could—" "No." The word was flat, final. The Reverend's eyes narrowed. "You can't just keep them. There are rules. Kin might come looking." At the word kin, May flinched. Nathaniel saw it, and something fierce and protective rose up in him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket. He opened it and showed the preacher the strange symbol. "This is all they had. You recognize this?" Reverend Harron's face went pale. All the holy righteousness drained right out of him, replaced by a stark, naked fear. He stumbled back a step, his hand making a warding sign. "Where did you get that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "It was on their mother." The preacher stared at the children, not with concern now, but with horror. "You fool," he hissed. "You haven't taken in orphans. You've brought a curse into your home. You've invited him here." "Him who?" Nathaniel demanded, but the preacher was already backing out the door. "Get rid of them, Nathaniel, before he comes. Get rid of them, or he'll burn you and this whole town to the ground." He scrambled onto his horse and galloped away, as if the devil himself was at his heels. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, the cold locket in his hand, watching the dust settle. The preacher's terror was real, and it was contagious. A cold dread started to seep into the warmth of the cabin. He hadn't just found 2 orphans. He'd found the target of a hunt. And now the hunter was coming for him. The preacher's fear lingered in the air long after he was gone. It was a poison. Nathaniel looked at May, who had watched the whole exchange, her eyes wide. He looked at the baby, sleeping peacefully in her crate, oblivious. He had thought the town's judgment was the biggest threat. He was wrong. There was something else out there, something so terrible it could make a man of God run in fear. "What did he mean?" May asked, her voice a tiny thread of sound. "A curse?" He couldn't tell her the truth, because he didn't know it himself. He just knelt down in front of her. "That preacher talks too much. Don't you worry, nobody's coming here." It was a lie. He could feel it. The world had shrunk. It was no longer the vast, empty prairie. It was this cabin, and the darkness pressing in on all sides. He started carrying his rifle with him everywhere, even just to the woodpile. He checked the horizon constantly, looking for any sign of a rider, any plume of dust that didn't belong. Sleep became a luxury he couldn't afford. He would sit in his rocker all night, the rifle across his lap, listening to the breathing of the 2 children and the sound of his own heart pounding in his ears. He tried to piece it together, the mother's wounds, the locket, the preacher's terror. It all pointed to one thing: these girls were running from someone powerful, someone ruthless. One evening, he was cleaning his rifle by the fire when May came to sit beside him. She was quiet for a long time, watching the flames. "Mama was always scared," she said softly. "She told me we had to keep moving, never stay in one place too long." "Did she say why?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. May shook her head. "She said he had eyes everywhere, that he could smell fear. She told me to be brave, but I'm not." "You are," he said, his voice rough. "You're the bravest little girl I've ever met." He looked down at the locket again, which he now kept on a string around his own neck, hidden under his shirt. He'd stared at that strange symbol of the snake and the star for hours. It felt familiar, tugging at a memory he'd buried long ago. A memory from before the silence, before his wife. A time when he rode with men who had no fear of God or the law. And then it hit him. A jolt, cold and sharp as a knife in the gut. He knew the symbol. He hadn't seen it in 15 years, not since the night he'd walked away from a life of violence, leaving it all behind in a cloud of gunsmoke and blood. It was the mark of the Black Star Regulators, a gang of men so vicious they were more like a plague than outlaws. They didn't just rob you, they took everything: your land, your life, your hope. And their leader, a man they called the Prophet, was the most terrifying man Nathaniel had ever known. A man who believed he was a god, and that everything and everyone belonged to him. The blood drained from Nathaniel's face. The woman on the hill. She must have been one of his, maybe one of his many wives. And these children, this baby, they were the prophet's children. He hadn't just found orphans. He had stolen the property of the devil himself. And the devil was coming to collect. The realization settled in his gut like a block of ice. He wasn't a random stranger who had stumbled upon a tragedy. Fate or something crueler had led these children directly to him, the one man in this whole territory who knew exactly how dangerous their father was. His past, the one he had ridden so hard and so long to escape, had finally caught up to him. He looked at May, her face illuminated by the firelight, and saw not just a little girl, but the daughter of a monster. He looked at the sleeping baby and saw an heir to a kingdom of fear. The prophet wouldn't be coming for them out of love. He'd be coming for them as a matter of possession, a matter of pride, and he would kill anyone who stood in his way. Nathaniel's first instinct was to run, to pack up the children and disappear into the mountains, to change their names, to never look back. It was what their mother had been trying to do, but he knew it was useless. The prophet's reach was long, his eyes were everywhere. Running would only delay the inevitable. No, the fight was coming here, to this cabin, to this little patch of land where he had tried to bury his old life. The next morning he rode into town, not for supplies, for information. The townspeople shied away from him, their fear of the Locket's curse making them treat him like a leper. He walked straight into the saloon. The place went quiet. He walked to the bar and faced Silas, who was also the town's part-time sheriff. "I need to know if you've seen any strangers," Nathaniel said, his voice low and hard, "men riding in a group. They'd have a mark on their saddles, a snake with a star." Silas's hand trembled as he wiped the bar. "We ain't seen nothin', Nathaniel. And we don't want to. Whatever trouble you brought home with you, you keep it there." "It's not my trouble anymore," a man slurred from the corner. "It's ours. The preacher said that Mark brings ruin." The fear in the room was thick enough to choke on. These people weren't going to help him. They would hand the children over in a heartbeat to save their own skins. He was on his own, just like always. But as he turned to leave, a gnarled old trapper in the back corner caught his eye. The old man gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the back door. Nathaniel left, mounting his horse and riding slowly out of town. A few minutes later, the trapper met him on the road. "You're a fool to ask questions in there," the old man rasped. "They'd sell their own mothers to keep the Black Star boys away." "You know them?" "Everyone knows them," the trapper spat. "I saw 2 of them yesterday, watching the road to your place from the high ridge. They ain't making a move yet. They're just watching, waiting for the prophet to give the word." The trap was already being set. They knew where he was. "Thank you," Nathaniel said. "Don't thank me," the trapper said, turning to go. "I'm getting out of this territory before the storm hits. If you got a lick of sense, you'll do the same. Leave the bait behind and run." Nathaniel watched him go, leave the bait behind. He thought of May's trusting eyes, of the baby's tiny hand curling around his finger. They weren't bait. They were his. He had sworn it on a Bible. He had sworn it to their mother. He had sworn it to himself. He rode home not with fear, but with a cold, hard resolve. His years of silence were over. The man he used to be, the man who knew how to fight, the man who understood the darkness because he had once lived in it, was waking up. When he got back to the cabin, he didn't go inside. He walked the perimeter of his land, his eyes seeing it in a new way. Not as a home, but as a battlefield. He noted the shallow draw, the thicket of trees, the rocky outcrop. He was planning, preparing. That night, he pulled out a loose floorboard near the hearth. From the dark space beneath, he pulled a wrapped bundle of oilcloth. He unrolled it on the table. Inside were 2 Colt revolvers, worn from use but perfectly clean. His old guns. The ones he had sworn never to touch again. May came and stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the weapons. She didn't look scared. She looked at him. "Are the bad men coming?" she asked. He looked at her, and for the first time, he gave her the whole truth. "Yes." "Are you going to send us away?" "No," he said, his voice like iron. "I'm not sending you away. I'm sending them away." He strapped the gun belt around his waist. It felt familiar, heavy, like a part of him he had cut off was suddenly whole again. He was no longer just Nathaniel Cross, the quiet rancher. He was the man who was going to stand between two innocent children and the coming darkness. The waiting was the worst part. Days bled into one another, each one stretched tight with a tension that never broke. Nathaniel worked from sunup to sundown, fortifying the cabin. He boarded up the back window, leaving only a small slit to shoot through. He stacked firewood against the weakest wall of the cabin. He dug a small trench at the edge of the clearing, a place to take cover. May watched him, her small face grim. She didn't play. She helped. She brought him nails. She filled canteens with water. She was a tiny soldier preparing for a war she couldn't understand. She named the baby Lily after the wildflowers on their mother's grave. It was an act of defiance, of claiming a future they might not have. The town abandoned them completely. No one rode by anymore. The road to his cabin was deserted. They had been cut off, left to face their fate alone. He was fine with that. He trusted the townsfolk about as far as he could throw them. The first sign came a week later. He found one of his few cattle dead by the creek, its throat cut, and carved into its hide was the symbol, the snake and the star. It was a message, a warning. We are here. We are watching. We can touch you whenever we want. That night, the wind howled, and every scrape of a branch against the roof sounded like footsteps. Nathaniel sat with his rifle, watching the darkness. May couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire, holding Lily, humming her mother's lullaby. "Tell me about him," she whispered into the quiet. "My father." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "He's not your father. A father protects his children. This man, he's just a monster who thinks he owns you. Why does he want us? He doesn't want you, May. He wants what you represent. He wants Lily because he thinks she's his legacy. And he wants you back because your mother defied him. It's about pride. That's all a man like him has." He fell silent for a moment, the memories churning. "I used to know him, a long time ago. I was young and foolish, and I thought his power was something to be admired. I saw him do things, terrible things. One day I saw him do something I couldn't stomach, and I left. I've been running from that memory ever since." He looked at her, his eyes full of a pain she was too young to understand. "Your mother was braver than I ever was. She didn't just run, she took you with her. She saved you." A single tear rolled down May's cheek, "And she found you." The simple faith in her words hit him harder than a bullet. She was right. All his running had led him right here, to this moment. It wasn't a curse. It was a chance. A chance to finally face the ghost he'd been running from his whole life. A chance for redemption. The attack came 3 nights later, under a moonless sky. He heard it first, the faint jingle of a harness, the soft whinny of a horse trying to stay quiet. He was already awake. He was always awake. He moved silently to the door, peering through a crack in the wood. He could see them, dark shapes moving in the deeper darkness at the edge of the trees. More than 2, maybe 5, or 6. He moved back, his heart pounding a steady, cold rhythm. He touched May's shoulder. She was instantly awake, her eyes wide. "They're here," he whispered. "I need you to do exactly as I say. Take Lily, get under the floorboards." He had cleared a space for them in the cellar, lining it with blankets. May didn't cry. She just nodded, her face pale but determined. She scooped up her sleeping sister, wrapped her tight, and disappeared through the trapdoor in the floor. Nathaniel took his position at the front window, his rifle ready. The silence outside stretched. They were toying with him, testing his nerve. Then a voice cut through the night, smooth and cultured, but with an edge of pure menace. "Nathaniel Cross, it has been a long time. I heard you'd settled down, found some peace. I can't have that." It was him, the prophet. His voice hadn't changed. "I've come for what is mine, Nathaniel, my daughter, my blood. Send her out, and I will let you live out the rest of your sad, quiet life." Nathaniel's knuckles were white on the rifle stock. "She's not yours anymore. She belongs to the dirt now," he yelled back, hoping the lie would buy him time or enrage the man into making a mistake. There was a soft chuckle from the darkness. "Oh, I'm not talking about the woman." I'm talking about the new one. The heir. My men saw you with her. Don't lie to me, Nathaniel. It's a sin, and I am the one who punishes sinners. The first shot shattered the window, spraying glass across the floor. The siege had begun. Gunfire erupted from all sides. Bullets tore through the thin wooden walls of the cabin, splintering wood, punching holes in his world. He dropped to the floor, crawling from the window to the side wall, firing back into the darkness. He didn't aim to kill, not yet. He aimed to make them think he was more than one man. To make them afraid. He fired, moved, fired again. He used both pistols, then the rifle. The cabin filled with smoke and the deafening roar of gunfire. He was a whirlwind of motion, a cornered animal fighting with everything he had. For hours it was a stalemate. They couldn't get close, and he couldn't drive them away. Then he heard a new sound, the crackle of flames. He looked out the slit in the boarded-up back window and saw it, a flickering orange glow. They had set the barn on fire. They were burning him out. Smoke started to seep through the walls, thick and acrid. Panic clawed at his throat. He could fight men. He couldn't fight fire. He looked at the trapdoor. May and Lily were down there. They would suffocate. He had to make a move. He had to get them out. He crawled to the trapdoor and lifted it. Smoke billowed down. May was coughing, her face streaked with soot. Lily was screaming, her cries thin and terrified. "We have to go," he said, his voice hoarse. "Stay behind me. Don't stop for anything. You run for the creek. You hide in the rocks. You hear me?" May nodded, her eyes streaming from the smoke. He took a deep breath, kicked the front door open, and charged out into the fiery night, firing both pistols. He was a demon emerging from the inferno, a roar of defiance in his throat. He saw two men fall before a searing pain exploded in his shoulder. He staggered, but he didn't fall. He turned and saw May scrambling out of the cabin. Lily clutched in her arms. "Run, May, run!" Another bullet grazed his leg. He went down on one knee, but he kept firing, providing cover for her. He watched her small figure disappear into the darkness toward the creek. She was safe, for now. He turned to face the men closing in, their faces lit by the fire of his burning home. The prophet stepped out from behind them, a long coat sweeping the ground, a serene smile on his face. "You always were stubborn, Nathaniel," he said, his voice calm amidst the chaos. "Look what it got you, a pile of ashes." Nathaniel gritted his teeth, the pain in his shoulder a dull, roaring fire. "They're gone. You won't find them." The prophet's smile widened. "Oh, I will. But first, penance." He nodded to his men. "He's yours." They descended on him. He fought back, a wounded bear, but there were too many. A rifle butt crashed against his head, and the world exploded into a shower of stars, then faded to black. He woke to the sound of dripping water. His head throbbed, a deep, pounding rhythm that seemed to shake his whole body. He was lying on a damp, cold floor. He tried to move, but his hands were bound tight behind his back. The fire was out. The only light was the pale grey of a false dawn filtering through the smoking ruin of his cabin. The prophet was sitting on a fallen log, cleaning his fingernails with the tip of a bowie knife. "Good morning, Nathaniel," he said without looking up. "Did you enjoy your rest?" "My men can be enthusiastic." Nathaniel's shoulder was a blaze of agony. He could feel the sticky warmth of blood soaking his shirt. He tested his bonds. They were solid. "Where is she?" Nathaniel growled, his voice a dry rasp. "Oh, the girl. She's a clever one. Just like her mother," the prophet said conversationally. He gestured with his knife. "Found her hiding in the rocks down by the creek, just like you told her to. She's quite safe. For the moment." Nathaniel's blood ran cold. He had failed. "What do you want?" The prophet finally looked at him, his eyes black and empty. "I want what is mine, my legacy, my heir. This world is a fallen place, Nathaniel. It needs a firm hand. My hand. My bloodline will rule this land long after you and everyone in that pathetic little town are dust. Your wife was a fool. She thought she could steal that future from me." "She wasn't your wife," Nathaniel spat. "She was your prisoner." "Possession is a matter of perspective," the prophet said with a shrug. "But she did take something else from me, something more valuable than a child. Before she fled, she stole my map." Nathaniel stared at him, confused. Map? Not just any map. A map to a place called Jacob's Canyon. It shows the location of a fortune in Union gold lost during the war. Enough to fund an army. My army. I believe she told the girl where it is. So you're going to help me persuade her to tell me? Two of his men dragged May forward. Her face was tear-stained but defiant. They were holding Lily, who was wailing. "Leave her alone," Nathaniel said, struggling against his ropes. The prophet ignored him, crouching down in front of May. "My dear child," he cooed, "your mother was a thief. She took something from me, a secret. Did she share it with you? Did she tell you about a special place? A drawing?" May stared at him, her chin trembling, but she said nothing. "No? A pity." The prophet stood up and walked over to Nathaniel. He pressed the tip of the cold knife against Nathaniel's throat. "Perhaps seeing an old friend suffer will loosen your tongue, my dear." He looked at May. "Tell me where the map is, or I will send him to meet your mother." May's eyes darted between the knife at Nathaniel's throat and the prophet's cold face. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Nathaniel saw the conflict in her eyes, the terror. "Don't tell him anything, May." Nathaniel choked out. "Nothing." "Last chance, little bird," the prophet hissed. May's face suddenly went blank. The tears stopped. A strange calmness settled over her. She looked the prophet dead in the eye. "She gave it to me," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I have it." The prophet smiled, triumphant. "Excellent. Where?" "It's not a paper," May said. She stitched it. Into the blanket. The one my sister is wrapped in." All eyes went to the baby. One of the men holding Lily roughly started to unwrap the bundle. The prophet watched, his eyes gleaming with greed. As the man fumbled with the cloth, his attention was completely focused on the task. And that was the moment May had been waiting for. With a speed that was shocking in a child so small, she twisted and bit down hard on the hand of the man holding her. He yelled in pain and surprise, his grip loosening for just a second. It was all she needed. She broke free and ran, but she didn't run away. She ran straight at the man unwrapping the blanket. He was off balance, surprised. She launched herself at him, a tiny fury knocking him sideways. He stumbled and Lily tumbled from his arms. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The baby falling through the air. The prophet's look of rage. Nathaniel, roaring, throwing his entire body weight forward, knocking over the man who held the knife to his throat. And then a gunshot. It wasn't from the prophet's men. It came from the ridge. Then another. And another. The townsfolk. Led by the old trapper and Silas the storekeeper, a dozen men were lined up on the ridge, rifles firing. The preacher's words, the fire, the gunshots in the night, it had finally been enough to shame them into action. They weren't going to let the prophet burn them down next. The prophet's men, caught completely by surprise, scattered, diving for cover. In the chaos, Nathaniel rolled, smashing his bound hands against a sharp rock until the ropes frayed and snapped. He grabbed a pistol from a fallen outlaw and came up firing. He saw the prophet snatch Lily from the ground and run for his horse. Nathaniel didn't hesitate. He ran after him, ignoring the fire in his shoulder and leg. He tackled the man just as he reached his horse, sending them both tumbling into the dirt. Lily rolled clear, crying but unharmed. They fought in the dust, two men who were ghosts of each other's past. It wasn't about gold or maps anymore. It was about a little girl named May and a baby named Lily. It was about a promise made to a dying woman. It was about a man's last chance to be good. Nathaniel was stronger. His rage, his love for those children, gave him a strength the prophet's greed could never match. He landed a final brutal punch, and the prophet lay still. By the time Silas and the other men got down from the ridge, it was over. The remaining Black Star regulators had fled or were dead. Nathaniel stood, breathing heavily, his body screaming in pain, and picked up Lily. He held her tight. May ran to him, wrapping her arms around his legs. "You saved us," she sobbed. He knelt, pulling her into the hug. "No," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us." He looked at her, his eyes filled with awe. There was no map in the blanket. He knew it. She had lied. She had risked everything on a bluff to create a diversion. A 5-year-old girl had outsmarted the most feared man in the territory. Silas came up, looking ashamed. "Nathaniel, we're sorry we didn't—" Nathaniel just shook his head, looking at the smoking ruins of his home. Just help me round them up. The fight was over. The prophet and his men were handed over to the law. The town, humbled and grateful, helped Nathaniel rebuild his cabin, bigger and stronger than before. They brought lumber and food, offering quiet help instead of whispered judgments. They had seen what he was willing to do for those girls, and it had reminded them of who they were supposed to be. Life found a new rhythm, a peaceful one. The silence never returned. The cabin was filled with May's laughter and Lily's gurgles. Nathaniel's wounds healed, leaving scars that told a story not of a lonely man, but of a father. He had faced his past and had won. He was no longer running. He was home. One evening, months later, the three of them sat on the porch of the new cabin, watching the sunset, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. May leaned against him and Lily slept in his arms. "We ain't orphans no more," May said softly, repeating the words she had said by the firelight so long ago. Nathaniel looked down at the two girls who had saved him from himself. "No," he said, his heart full, "we ain't." He had found them in the dust, two lives on the brink of being swallowed by the world. And in saving them, he had finally, truly saved himself. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you.